Okay, welcome back to the reading of the first verse of the Haftarah, the selected reading from the prophets. The actual earliest source where we see this practice of reading the Haftarah is in the New Testament. So in Luke chapter 4, verses 16 to 21, Jesus is in a synagogue in Nazareth, and he is in the synagogue, and he is given, he is reading from Isaiah 61, pretty much as we would have in a synagogue today, reading a selected reading from the prophets. Here we are in the weekly portion of Terumah. Again, we're reading from the first verse of the Haftarah, once regular, once with a melody. Vadonai natan chokhmah lishlomo, כאשר דיבר לו, ויהי שלום בין חירם ובין שלמה, ויכרתו ברית שניהם. ואדוני נתן חוכמה לשלמה, כאשר דיבר לו, ויהי שלום בין חירם ובין שלמה, ויכרתו ברית שניהם. Okay, so let's look at the verbs that we have here. We have the verb natan, we have the verb diber, we have the verb vayhi, and we have the verb vayichretu. Remember last week we've talked about vayichretu berit. We've explained the connection between this verb that means cutting and the action of establishing a covenant, making a covenant. So now you know that when the Bible talks about Hiram and Shlomo, Hiram and Solomon establishing a covenant, in biblical Hebrew they cut a covenant. So that's vayichretu. The verb vayhi, second point that I want to make, is very interesting. Oftentimes this verb is at the beginning of units, opening units. Some scholars would call it a boundary marker. So it's the most common verb at the beginning of biblical books, for instance. But in those cases, it is usually followed by a temporal phrase. It was at a certain time. And so you begin a story, like once upon a time in English. Here, it is actually describing what was. There was peace, vayhi shalom, not followed by a temporal phrase. And so shalom, okay, is the subject of the verb was. Peace was between Hiram and Solomon. Note that Hebrew, third point I'll make here, is repeating that concept of the preposition that reflects between. So in English, you do something between A and B, but you don't repeat the preposition between. You don't make peace between Israel and between Jordan. You make peace between Israel and Jordan. Hebrew oftentimes repeats the preposition. Okay, so that's the third point. Oh, I didn't ask you a riddle last week, so I can ask you two riddles now. So obviously the connection between the portion of Terumah and the portion of the Haftarah, the selected reading that is chosen for Terumah, is the building of the temple or the building of the tabernacle. And now the portion of Terumah starts with calling for people to give all kinds of substances for the building of the tabernacle. Basically, who called the people to bring wood in order to build the temple? So that's for the weekly portion of Terumah. For last week, the weekly portion of Mishpatim, I'll ask you a different question. The weekly portion of Mishpatim is talking about the fact that someone who murders premeditated murder, who commits a premeditated murder, should be taken to death, even if he is holding the corners of the altar. Who was indeed taken, even though he was in the prophets? Who is mentioned as being taken, even though he was holding the corners of the altar? And I will see you next week.